you hear me well?
Yes, sir. Can you hear me good?
Yes, very good.
All right. I started recording, so we could just go ahead and get started. The last time we spoke, no one was sure. You even said maybe 50-50 as to whether or not Vladimir Putin would invade Ukraine. Now I feel like a lot of the thought around this is that he will. The president, United States president, has said it's more than likely. He's getting a lot of the people out of Ukraine, Americans out of Ukraine. What are you hearing as far as the likelihood now, a week later, as to whether or not Vladimir Putin will invade Ukraine?
Well, everybody is watching whether or not Putin will actually fulfill his promise to withdraw the troops. We've heard from the Russian defense minister yesterday that Russia is completing its military exercises that they were conducting along the Ukrainian border. And they pledged, the Russian leadership pledged, that all the Russian troops will be withdrawn and sent back to their bases. Now, there are conflicting reports on whether that is in fact happening. We've heard from the NATO General Secretary that they are not seeing the actual withdrawal of troops. Others are suggesting that only a small share of Russian troops are being withdrawn from the Ukrainian border. By contrast, Russian television, Russian media are ridiculing American claims about the imminent invasion and are showing on television, they're showing the withdrawal of Russian tanks and the departure of the Russian soldiers. So they're claiming that Americans are actually exaggerating the threat that Russia poses to Ukraine. Now, Ukrainians themselves have mobilized over the last week, and certainly for many Ukrainians, the signs that came from Washington, the claims about the imminence of the invasion, the withdrawal of the U.S. embassy and the transfer of the U.S. embassy personnel from Kiev to Lviv, which is a city in western Ukraine, far away from the Russian border. All of these were strong signals of the seriousness of risks that Ukraine faces at this point. So as a result, in response to these signals, the Ukrainian leadership organized major mobilization effort. Yesterday, there was a new holiday proclaimed, National Unity Day, and thousands, tens of thousands of Ukrainians went out on the streets of Ukrainian cities, holding Ukrainian flags and showing solidarity and willingness to face up to the possible Russian invasion. So these are all signs that the Ukrainian society is strongly supportive of its leadership and is willing to respond to any possible act of aggression on the part of Russia.
Is this potentially, in your opinion, just another case of Vladimir Putin being dishonest and saying one thing and doing another? Or do you think he's really would rather talk it out and withdraw the troops?
We've seen over the last week efforts by the French and German leaders to start a diplomatic track and intensify negotiations over the settlement of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And I just want to remind you that the Eastern Ukrainian crisis and separatist insurgency is at the center of the dispute between Russia and Ukraine. And hence, if there is progress in negotiations on this particular issue, we may see de-escalation. At this point, it does not seem like the diplomatic process will progress and go forward. There are signs that Putin is willing to wait some time and see how diplomatic process will play out. But clearly, this is a question of weeks, not a question of months. Russians are clearly very impatient. They're not willing to wait for a long period of time for the resolution of that diplomatic process. So most likely what we are seeing is an attempt to placate the Western public opinion, demonstrate that the Russian side is interested in peace, and that the only way in which conflict may happen is because of aggressive actions on the part of the West. And that is, in fact, what they are accusing Western leaders of. They're accusing them of plotting some kind of an attack on Russia through the proxy of the Ukrainian, using the proxy of the Ukrainian forces.
If you were there right now in Ukraine, would you feel the need to get out?
There is no mass refugee crisis on the borders of Ukraine. There is no mass fleeing of Ukrainians. And that is another sign of a resilience of the Ukrainian society in the face of a serious threat. I personally do not think I would be leaving the country because there is this commitment to the Ukrainian integrity and independence on the part of the society. And so there is a sense that this may be a decisive, a turning point in the Ukrainian history where we either ultimately reassert our full independence or we lose the independent state, and that will be a major defeat for generations to come.
If Vladimir Putin is to invade, Russia invades Ukraine, would it be a quick entrance? Would it take a while? Would Ukraine fall to Russia quickly, or would it take a little while?
It will take a very significant, it will be very costly, and it will take a long time for the Russian troops to be able to capture territory. In fact, I do not believe that they would be able to control most of the Ukrainian territory for any extended period of time, primarily because it will require very significant commitment of troops that Russia needs in other parts of the state, because there are other areas of Russia that may be under threat. And remember that Russia still has internal conflicts within itself, especially in the North Caucasus, which are not fully resolved. So Russia needs to maintain a significant amount of troops in other areas. So it cannot fully deploy all of its combat operations to Ukraine. Most likely, we are going to see an attempt to control small areas within Ukraine and use them as a lever in further negotiations with the West. In other words, areas of Ukraine that may be more pro-Russian, more Russia-leaning, will be taken over. And then new negotiations will start over the future of Ukraine and its status, whether or not Ukraine wants to join NATO, on whether Ukraine will become a neutral state and commit itself to avoiding any types of alliances with the West.
If President Putin were to do that and take over parts of Ukraine and then hold them, like you said, in hopes of negotiating elsewhere, how much ground does President Putin lose with the rest of the world leaders for having gone into Ukraine in the first place? Does that just shut the door as far as negotiations go, especially since sanctions will probably be heavy at that point?
Well, it certainly will be an explicit violation of the international law, which will be very hard to justify. What's important is that the West already called Putin, called him out and demonstrated that they know about his secret plans. So it will be very hard for Putin to justify any type of aggression. But I do not think that this type of action will prevent Putin from further negotiations with the Western leaders. What many European leaders fear is a spillover effect from Ukraine to other parts of Europe. They fear a large number of refugees. They fear possibly subversive actions on the part of Russia in other parts or in other countries of the European Union. So in fact, I think particularly Europeans would be more willing to negotiate with Putin and more willing to persuade the Ukrainian leadership or pressure the Ukrainian leadership to agree to certain types of compromises. It is hard to imagine that the United States would be willing and the US leadership would be willing to negotiate with Putin under these circumstances. So most likely we are going to see talks happening primarily between Europeans and Putin.
All right, at that point, how effective would our sanctions be if the rest of the world is willing to negotiate with him, and the United States is the only holdout. How effective is a sanction at that point?
Well, Russia is prepared to face tough sanctions. And in fact, over the last 8 years, we've seen a lot of steps that have been taken by Putin and the Russian leadership to relocate some of the assets that they have in the West, to persuade many of the Russian wealthy elites to bring back their wealth into Russia, in order to be more immune to these types of sanctions that may be coming from the Western countries. We also see a realignment of Russia with China, and China as a big friend of Russia right now, as the key strategic, economic, political, and military ally that Russia acquired, I think will help Russia to survive these sanctions, and will provide Russia with additional channel of financial assistance in case there will be a pressure on the Russian currency and other problems with Russian banks and financial system. So given that partnership, the strategic partnership between Russia and China, that in the words of the China leader, is eternal, I think that Russia will be able at least to survive at the early phase, in the initial phase, the sanctions that the West will impose against it.
You bring up a great point there, something I wasn't even thinking about asking, but an alliance between Russia and China. That's huge. That's an alliance that I don't know if the rest of the world could shatter or have any kind of effect on.
Absolutely. And that alliance has been in the making for the last 10 years at least. And it certainly accelerated after 2014, after Russia faced international isolation and realized that the only partner that they can rely on, and they have something in common, and that is an interest in maintaining their political regimes, their authoritarian systems, an interest in influencing and sometimes bullying their neighbors without any repercussions. These are all shared interests that are pursued under the cover of protecting their sovereign rights and independence. Both Russia and China talk about the need for a multipolar world, a need to take their interests into account, and they all bash, of course, Western countries. So they have an ideological affinity, they have political and military affinity, but Russia in this relationship is a much weaker partner, because Russia has maybe 10% of China's GDP, and its economy is much, much smaller. And so there is an asymmetry, at least in economic terms, in the relationship between Russia and China. And that poses itself additional risks for Russia in the long term.
Some scary stuff, Professor. Sum it up for me. Where do you think we go next? What happens next?
Well, over the next several weeks, we will still see attempts to find some kind of a diplomatic solution to the crisis. So I do not think that there will be an escalation happening along the border in the nearest future. But as I said, the time for negotiations is short. The window of opportunity is small. And possibly in early March, we may see actions on the part of Russia in case diplomatic negotiations fail. And remember, that will coincide with another military actions that Russia took in Ukraine, and that is the annexation of Crimea that happened in March of 2014. So we are going to look for that period in March for some more serious actions on the part of Russia if diplomacy fails.
All right, Professor Kudelia, thank you so much for talking with us again. I had just a few set of questions, and it always expands into more because you add more layers onto it. It's very interesting. So thank you so much for talking to us.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me.
Have a good evening.